Ever since I was an undergraduate, I've been interested in police behavior, police brutality, and things like this. I remember when I was in barber school before I went to college, at a place they referred to as Skid Row, I would watch the police round up the so-called winos and beat the shit out of them on the way to the jail. And when they got to the jail, they'd say, well, the guy was resisting arrest. And this was sort of standard operating procedure. You rough the people up a little bit, maybe they won't come back. Maybe you won't have to worry about them later. I think this was carried out in the extreme of the ride the Baltimore police gave a prisoner to the jail when he died because of the rough transportation. But anyway, we haven't had a really brutal war with many casualties in decades, although we've been at various places like Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., but none quite like the Vietnam days. We haven't had the unrest that we did in the Vietnam days. Vietnam was unique because we had people protesting the war for the first time, questioning the government's decision to go to war, an anti-war movement, an anti-draft movement, along with civil unrest on behalf of minorities, all congealing together at one time, which scared the shit out of the power elite, I suppose. In fact, I know that. So, having been committed to change and been an activist ever since high school, and having had enough of the Nixon administration's change, and not for the better, but for the worse, I took a view and studied political reality with the idea in mind of running for office. So I thought about it. What office could I run at and effectuate the most change? And that was district attorney. Well, many of those who knew me couldn't picture me as a district attorney. I suppose in a way I couldn't either, because there are many remedies that I believed in rather than prosecution, jail, and things like this. But since I believed in them, how was I going to get them to the attention of the public and the policymakers unless I was in a position to do so? And the best position to do so would be that of the district attorney. So I went out and crusaded and came within 221 votes of being the district attorney of Boulder, Colorado. Now we're seeing a lot of all of this stuff coming back to us almost a half century later with Black Lives Matters and all of this kind of stuff. Blue lives matter, Black lives matter. My view is it's not a matter of race. My view is justice matters. And we don't have justice because we have a corrupt system. And we don't have a justice because we have a government selling fear to the citizenry. They've got like a mafia scam selling protection. And the police are their enforcers for the protection scheme. That's entirely unnecessary. But we don't have too many people speaking out that remember over long periods of time what it was before the police state sort of took over. I can remember starting out, I represented a lot of what they called hippies. I did a lot of drug cases. Mainly my practice was confined to constitutional law, and criminal law was where the Constitution was mostly put into jeopardy. And that's where I decided would be my battleground for social change. So we have a whole bunch of people that believe in the Vietnam War, but they don't really believe in the Vietnam War. What they don't want to do is question their government. Their position was, our government right or wrong? Well, that's got a lot of problems, particularly in a democratic structured society, because the voters and the people should make up their own minds. But there's been an attack on that by the propaganda forces of the government. Now, during this period of time, I had a younger brother who was in, I guess, search and rescue would be the best way to define it, except for he wasn't in Vietnam. He was rescuing people and inserting people in places that we did not admit existed. After the war, he started picking up satellites from the ocean and went to work for National Reconnaissance Organization. And then, meanwhile, staying with search and rescue. The end result was that he trained people for the Iranian hostage rescue. His unit trained with the Entebbe people, with the British SAS Special Air Services, various other anti-terror squad. His unit at that time ended up being called Blue Light. Now, I defy any of you out there to assert that any member of Blue Light was a coward. They were unsung heroes in a lot of respects. I remember one time discussing with my brother the fact that the Blue Light unit kept being moved around. And I said, why is it moved out of the direct line of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? And his comment was, and with a wry smile, that it was kind of difficult when you were investigating your own people. And that was the first inkling of the engagement of various governmental activities in the drug trade in our country, which I found out much later to be, or confirmed much later. However, when I was running for office, before I started all this stuff, I was a sociologist, and I think a pretty fair one. And I did a sociogram of all of the drug trafficking in the county, and I pinpointed, using net bias random net theory and sociograms and things like this, 5 identifiable groups that were involved in marijuana trade in Boulder. 4 of these groups have had people arrested, and the 5th one didn't. So I bravely ran for office, saying I identified 5 drug groups, and I wanted to find out why one of them wasn't being prosecuted. The other thing that happened is I got involved with a bureaucratic war between the CIA and the FBI over a college professor disappearing in Boulder named Thomas Rehab, who was a client of mine, and the accusation against another client of mine, Delia Tannenbaum, that he caused either his disappearance or death. Letters addressed to me ended up in the FBI's office. Apparently, my client Tannenbaum got sent to the state hospital for evaluation, and her correspondence, rather than coming to my office, was misdelivered to the FBI office in Boulder. Apparently, the bureaucrats in Pueblo, the state hospital, couldn't get my address right. I don't know. After I lost my DA's election, I was allowed to look at the file by Alexander Hunter, who'd been my opponent, and I noticed that the letters addressed to me were in that file. Also, there was an autopsy in which Mrs. Tannenbaum was alleged to have committed suicide. The autopsy showed just the contrary. It really cast doubt on the fact whether or not it was a suicide. According to the autopsy, it took her 20 minutes to die of sodium cyanide poisoning. Now, she was a tough lady, but I don't think that tough. In any event, that case caused a breach of liaison between FBI and CIA. Richard Helms got fired. J. Edgar Hoover broke off a liaison. The Nixon administration started a group called Plumbers, which ended up in the Watergate scandal. Meanwhile, I'm bouncing around Boulder running for office, trying to effectuate some change with the draconian laws that were being proposed. I didn't see where they'd do any good. Now, the curious thing is I've been a defense attorney for several years at this point, and I had a lot of support among my clientele who had been involved in the drug trade. I also had a lot of support with the various police departments in the county and also in Denver. And I think the main reason was a matter of trust. I wasn't going to go out on a political agenda and screw some people because it made good headlines. Both sides that supported me were of the opinion that I would be fair in that position. Now, my opponent was supported greatly by the police, and even to the point where a few policemen's wives contacted me after the election and told me how the police had, or certain members of the police department had gone about to sabotage my election. And they did a pretty good job of it. I was accused of a $30 million plot to kidnap a client, $10 million jewel robbery and arson and a few other things, witness tampering. I was investigated and audited by the IRS every Friday for 87 consecutive weeks, mainly just to put me out of circulation so I could never run for office again, because I was getting too close to home. I made a certain intelligence agency nervous as whores in church because they thought I would expose the operation of them stuffing corpses with heroin from Tonson at Air Force Base in Saigon to Travis Air Force Base in California and then into Kirtland and up the San Luis Valley. I also had a broad enough clientele that I could put a lot of things together that made me formidable in their estimation. This is probably all irrelevant because what really matters was that as a sociologist, I could understand the structure and function of police behavior. And what I noticed occurring from the Nixon time on was that there was a them and us mentality developing. Prior to that time, I had many friends in the police department. Having been in the criminology department at University of Colorado, I knew a lot of policemen. One graduate student, Paul Katsampas, was a Boulder policeman on the narcotics detail. He later became a professor at Metro State University in professor of criminology. The chief probation officer in Denver was a client and a friend of mine, Sam Passarelli. And we all kind of knew each other, and we all had the attitude we were going after, pursuing the same goal, and that was some form of justice and betterment of society. It wasn't adversarial. I used to go out to lunch with district attorneys and deputy district attorneys. Quite often, I'd go out to lunch with police officers. I'd have coffee with them in the morning. A couple of them I'd have breakfast with every day, as well as defense attorneys and people like that. It was a group not divided but united for the benefit of society. Now, we did disagree with what would really be an effective way to benefit society, but we respected each other. That changed after the Nixon administration. I used to get invited and go to a lot of police retirement parties. I haven't been to a police retirement party since 1985. I haven't had lunch with a bunch of detectives probably since 1995, although so many of the older detectives are still friends of mine. And we see each other and have a drink together occasionally, but not while they're active policemen. I'm sorry, excuse me. So I hope many of you remember viewing my little lecture on apocalyptic thinking. I think that fits into this quite a bit. Apocalyptic thinking was developed later in our society along with Contract on America or Contract for America, things like this, the whole Patriot movement, various right-wing movements, which got emboldened with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The fear factor came in with the civil rights movement and the militant blacks and things like this. So they started dividing and conquering the population of the United States, turning one faction against another. And they did it along racial lines. Any sane person studying the problem knows this isn't a racial problem, it's an economic problem, a matter of status and redistribution of wealth. So what we've seen in the present administration is probably the biggest redistribution of wealth in the history of this nation. And we're talking about Black Lives Matter, Gray Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, and shit like this along a racial line. Now, if I were doing slogans, I'd say peasantry matters. Or better yet, justice matters, because in all this conflict, justice has been abandoned. And the concept of justice has been equated with punishment rather than fairness. And that's unfortunate. That's because we're at the position we are now. Nobody's looking at what's good for the benefit of society. Nobody's looking out for what's going to benefit the people. It's how can I benefit myself? Nobody that I know of in the younger generations are saying, what can I do for my country? Like those of us of my generation did after Kennedy called us to action. It's what can I get out of my country? What can I get out of my job? What can I rip off before somebody else rips me off? That seems to be the general attitude. And that goes down to your politicians. The politicians aren't looking for social change or helping people ordinarily. They're looking for political power. I mean, think of this. Why would somebody spend millions of dollars to get put into an office that pays hundreds of thousands? That's ridiculous. When I ran for district attorney, my opponent spent $120,000 for a job that paid $36,000 a year. I spent $5 and was able to stay in the game because of the equal time provisions of the constitutional provision of licensing of media. Anyway, in order to stay in office then and spend that kind of money and use it effectively, the politician has to look more at the idea of constituents. And what happens now is that all the district attorneys, the people responsible for prosecuting and setting policy on prosecution, get their support from a block of voters known as the police. Now, this is different from when I ran for office because I had support from both police and the so-called criminals. Why? Because I wasn't going to go after anybody in particular. I wasn't going to profile. I wasn't going to single people out. I was going to try to be fair to everybody. And the voters that voted for me recognized that. And the police that voted for me recognized that. To them, I wasn't a defense attorney getting scumbag defendants off on technicalities. I was a man running for office on a platform of justice and fairness for all, not targeting and not punishing and not making agendas. And as later politicians started doing, when our law system started deteriorating, thinking about sending a message to impose my definition of things on others. Back when I started practicing law, any attorney that said he was going to ask the jury to send a message by convicting somebody would probably have gotten disbarred. Now it's common practice. Anyway, that's enough to think about today. I'll have more on this tomorrow. Enjoy your day. Thank you. Bye.